Hey everyone, this is Saraya back with Purposeful Professional Media. Today's guest is truly somebody special and one of my favorite people. Today's guest is Uche, an advocate for social impact entrepreneurs globally and an inspiring mental health professional. Uche and I sat down and talked vulnerably about a broad swath of topics from mental health in West Africa and Zimbabwe to her upbringing in boarding school, her interest in entrepreneurship, and how her own mental health experiences gave her a sense of purpose and North Star to pursue a career in mental health herself. Listen up for a revelation of who Uche is, her inspirational story, her unique Zimbabwean and Nigerian identity, and how she plans to make an impact from entrepreneurship to mental health and beyond. Let's get into today's exciting episode. Hey everybody, it's me, it's Saraya, back with the Purposeful Professional, the podcast for the people, your career, and the culture. And today I have a very special guest, Uche. Uche works with the Watson Institute. She is an advocate for social entrepreneurs. She's one of those people, like, I met her and I was like, her energy's different. Like, I met Uche and I was like, Uche is peace. Like, she's very calm, but she has a serene presence. And I really am excited to delve deep into her story, her upbringing, but also her career aspirations because she's such an interesting and multifaceted person. So, Uche, introduce yourself to the people on the podcast.
Yes, thank you, Soraya. That's such a wholesome introduction. I was smiling throughout. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. So my name is Uche Chukwobona, but I go by Uche, and I studied social entrepreneurship and am currently working for a nonprofit that's a social entrepreneurship accelerator program for entrepreneurs, offering different programs, actually different fellowships, suited for wherever the fellows are working in, like their domains, and yeah, just providing them with the tools and resources they need to upskill their ventures and their skills as entrepreneurs and co-founders. So yeah, I studied social entrepreneurship, but when I did so, it was combined with an interest in psychology and mental health. So I was basically studying business, but also with a sub focus on mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's super interesting. Speaking of mental health, what we really try to do with this segment is get guests in their element. So we tried to talk about a pop culture topic related to the guest's background or even their professional or personal interests. So I saw this article in the New York Times on mental health and hairdressing in West Africa. And basically, there's a New York Times article outlining a specific intervention where mental health services and programs are utilizing African hairdressers as a conduit for reaching and treating the target population, which are African women. So I figured because you have that mental health interest, but also that you're from Zimbabwe, I wanted to talk a lot about, what you think about this intervention, but also some of the issues that you might see when it comes to mental health also on the African subcontinent or continent. So let's get into it. Growing up in Zimbabwe and being of both like Southern and West African descent, like what were some prevailing messages you received about mental health? Were they positive or negative, and why?
Yes. So the article is very an interesting article because the way they approach it with the training, but also trying to balance the hairdressers' mental health, even as they offer these resources, is fascinating. So that's the first thing. But I think also because I also have a Western African background. My dad is Nigerian, and then my mom is Zimbabwean. So I can see how the two cultures are similar in the way that people perceive mental health. So a lot of the messages I received, literally directly as a child and like as a teenager, were more on, well, this is like from a religious perspective, this is the devil, this is demonic, it's an evil spirit, and also you're seeking for attention, it's not real, like you're just lazy, you're not working hard, especially on the depression side. Then in terms of anxiety symptoms, it was a lot of, oh, you're overthinking, why can't you just like focus on the small things. There was a little like the lack of knowledge and ignorance came off as a lack of empathy, in that, okay, why would someone feel like this and what can I do to help them just live through it. So very much a lot of blame and shame around it. Yeah.
Yeah, I let me tell you, sometimes I'm like, wow, did I grow up in Africa too?
Yeah.
Because
Similar.
across the diaspora,
Yeah.
a lot of us dealt with the same things. We dealt with some very similar things, especially around things and consequences of mental health. You talked about it being a spirit. So there's this over spiritualizing sometimes of mental health and not addressing, the real aspects of the disorder that aren't necessarily spiritual, but more so physical. We know now about chemical imbalances and different things that can happen even when we don't get enough exposure to our vitamins. Different things can happen in the brain. And then also, you're right, there's thing of like, toughen up, like deal with it. Why are you stressing over the small things? Certain cultures haven't been given the ability to exhale. Like there's a lot of like spaces in the United States for Black people specifically that have some sort of like waiting to exhale in their title. And I noticed that, and I always think to ourselves, we haven't been given the ability to even breathe. And if we haven't even been given the ability to breathe, how is our mental health taken seriously? So I understand everything you're saying. And thank you for providing that context of, the West African context, but also the Zimbabwean context. I didn't know that they were the same and it came to mental health. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting because with mental health, it always seems like the world is just literally one block when it comes to the stigma. But then it's like your cultures are so different. And even if they're not like immensely different, it's just how are you thinking the same? Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So the article also states that while mental health is being more widely discussed, the stigma still remains. I want to know from you, like, why do you think the stigma still impacts how mental health is viewed in Africa?
I think essentially the stigma is the perception, right? I believe what holds it is definitely like the very bottom of the system. So things like, at least I can speak for Zimbabwe, the religious aspect, but also the cultural aspect is in traditionally how people view it. And not to disqualify the validity of the spirituality and religion as it comes to, getting better and managing symptoms and things like that. But I think, like you mentioned, the over spiritualization and reliance on, let me speak from a Christian perspective, God healing everything is sort of one of the things that holds it together. So it's more like if you, why are you not healing from your depression? One, it's an evil spirit holding you back, but also you're not having enough faith. So because people believe that faith should really just, be the end all be all of all like your problems, it's just something that's so like because you can't disprove it with fact, and something that holds the stigma together because it's like you should feel shameful for not believing in God. Like why are you not trusting God to solve your problems or to heal your grief and things like, well, if you lose your job and you get depressed, why not trusting God and just being happy that one day you have a job? But people are not looking at it as the impact that maybe your job or breakup has really had on your physical body and even changed maybe the way your I'm not a neuroscientist, but the way your brain is, operating. Then I think from a cultural perspective, it's also similar. It's just, it's more like people have this perception that depression is a Western disease. So it's like, it's only for, I hate to say this, but people think it's only for white people. And so it's more like, why are you trying to seek for attention? So the way people have understood it or seen it portrayed on the media is what is also affecting how people perceive it or even how people empathize with it. An example I can give is people might be more tolerant, might stigmatize depression less compared to bipolar disorder. Because the moment you mention bipolar disorder, they're already thinking about the shows that they've watched, American produced shows, and how people with bipolar disorder have been so, being so out of control on those shows. And so now they're thinking you really have a demon. You need to be prayed for because why why are you acting like this? So that type of mentality is like what's holding it in place, at least from my personal experience and interactions.
I love how you broke it down. Like, first of all, I love how you broke it down so eloquently. So you're talking about there's a cultural aspect. I'm sure you're familiar with the term first world problems. Like, oh,
Yes,
depression,
exactly. That's
first
the
world.
right phrase for it.
Oh, here, it's beautiful in Africa, but also there might be more of a, just suck it up to survive. And I often hear people say that too, like, we're living a first world problem experience. And as a daughter of immigrants, sometimes that also shows up. Like, oh, am I living a first world experience? Am I like actually like mad about something that my parents and my ancestors weren't mad about? Yes, but it doesn't detract from my experience. So I love how you pointed out that cultural aspect, but also the Christian aspect, which is very, very heavy. You're right. Like we use scripture to invalidate other people. Sometimes we use Jesus, who, I'm a Christian, so I know who came to the world to literally heal the sick and help people, we use him to invalidate others. I think it's something that definitely needs to change. And thank you for adding that perspective for the listeners that, like, okay, this is how it is in Africa. Like, we're facing a stigma, not just because of a lack of, you would say, mental health literacy, but there are things that go beyond that. There's a culture that doesn't support it, and then there's also a religious influence that doesn't support it either.
Well, thank you. And that's very well said, especially how you brought in like the perspective of, well, this is actually how Jesus came in. I think the Christian listeners, need to pay attention to that piece. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to know, like, in terms of the actual intervention, do you agree with the idea of equipping hairdressers with the tools to address the mental health of women in West Africa? Why or why not?
A beautiful question. And I was thinking about it, but for me the answer was pretty obvious. Yes, and yes, yes, yes. Because kind of like how in the article they talk about hairdressers and like salons, and even at least in Zimbabwe, a lot of people are playing it in their backyard. I got my hair done in my bedroom and in the veranda, which is basically the front porch. Well, that's the equivalent of it as a child. And it's just so much conversation happens there between the hairdresser and, the person who's getting their hair done, but also the people who are just sitting around. So I definitely support it because I'm just like those informal, it's more like sneaking in the education and sneaking in like the support and the validation, that I'm there for you without having to be like, okay, you need to go to therapy, you need to be in the office. For people who think going to the office is for people who, I hate this word, but crazy, the therapist office. I think those informal settings are just ways to give them counseling without them even realizing that that's what's happening. And then the second thing is I support it too because a lot of African countries, and I can speak for Zimbabwe too, we don't have like enough psychiatrists and we don't have enough therapists and social workers that, can attend to everyone who is dealing with this. So the more people and the more ways we can innovatively incorporate these in the communities with basically the backing of research and all that stuff, the better. And so I know in my country we have what's got my favorite, the Friendship Bench Project, very similar to what's happening with the hairdressers in Senegal, correct? I think it's special because for them, the focus is on using youth, right, to give each other counseling and support. And so what they do is the reason it's called the friendship bench is they think of it as you sitting on a bench with maybe your friend and having a conversation, but you're using what they call problem solving therapy techniques to work them through their problems so that they are empowered to solve their problems. They also use sort of mother figures, so adult women, to do the same thing for their own peers. So it's peers not necessarily as youth, but also even the adults, like the middle aged people. So I highly support it because it's just the cost effective ways we can make this more, available. And I think accessibility is the most important thing in our space for something that is very underfunded.
Yeah, no, I love the fact that you talked about accessibility and how important accessibility is, because one thing I recognize is that it's almost like you feel like you're in a therapist chair when you're at the hairdresser. It's almost like you feel like like it's something about somebody putting their hands in your head. Especially for us, like Black people, like it's something about somebody putting their hands in your head that makes us just drop our guard and relax. And I'll even hear men say the same thing too. Like when I go to the barber, I can breathe. Like I'll hear all of those things. And one thing I know about West Africa is you talked a lot about, like, not even just West Africa, Zimbabwe, like anywhere in Africa, people get their hair braided oftentimes outside. So there's like a beautiful ambiance, because I see these TikTokers going to Nigeria and Ghana and getting these, like, like waist length braids for 100 US dollars and everything, and they're so grateful for the experience because there's food there, they're being fed, somebody with a soft touch has their hands in their hair, and it seems like it's such a informal but powerful cultural network. And I love the fact that you highlighted that it's these sort of experiences, and it's a way to like sneak it in. It's a way to kind of like, I don't know, like, parents put pudding when you take your medicine, they mix some pudding into the medicine, like they want the medicine to go down a bit easier. So it's one of those things, and I like the fact that you like it. I think it shows me that this type of intervention does work, and you talked about it working in Zimbabwe too. So that's very interesting. That the creativity coming out of the continent is crazy. Like people finding new ways to get that accomplished. Yeah. Yeah. All right. All right. So my last question for you is, because I know you're creative, you study social entrepreneurship. So I know you are creative and I know you can think outside the box when it comes to these social issues. So what is one intervention that you propose for African women to gain understanding of their mental health and the resources that are available?
This is another interesting question because we are tapping into creativity here, but we also need to account for the different places that these African women are in. So I think in order not to use a stereotype or overgeneralize, I'll stick more to the fact that things like art and music are very accessible, right? And a lot of women tend to be very intuitive and to use things like gardening, sewing, like hair braiding and stuff like that. So I do think that this is hard. Communal shared hobbies and spaces can be an intervention in the sense that this can be a space where they can have open conversation and what you call it, support groups. So I don't have like a solid like this is the one intervention, but I do think tapping into the things that they kind of do every day and are already accessible to them, like saying hi to your neighbor and talking to them about your garden. I think the more we can bring them together in the spaces that don't feel like extra work to them, the more we can use, licensed people to sit down with them and talk them through this. This is just very surface level answer, but it's hard. It's a hard question to answer because I really don't know. I would have to be in the specific environment to see what would work. Yeah. So that's a generalization.
Yeah. That was definitely a trick. That was a trick question, but I love how you answered it because it shows me that you're a real social entrepreneur. The right intervention is environment specific. You're right. Like it depends on the history of these women, the lineage of these women. But I love how you talked about like shared activities and that being the conduit because it's not even just hairdressing. It can be basket weaving. It can be like you said gardening. Anything that brings women together in a space can be used as an activity or a conduit for that conversation or resource sharing or even education on mental health. So yeah, I think you answered it. It was a social
Thank
entrepreneurship
you.
answer, and you answered it well, I would say. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that was a great pop purpose section that gave us a little bit of your expertise. Hopefully, that showed everything that you have to offer from mental health, the social entrepreneurship, to even cultural background. So, one thing we like to do is get into a little bit of who you are as a person. So, we call this the people section. And we want to really talk about who the person is behind the career so that our listeners can also connect the dots as we move through. So, I want to know, like, talk to us about being like half Zimbabwean and half Nigerian. Like, how did you navigate dual cultures growing up? And what did it teach you about yourself and your identity?
I always talk to my sister about this. Like, do you actually know that that's actually weird? Is that Nigerians and Zimbabweans are Africans, we are Black people, but then at the same time, why did it feel like we are like a blend? That's very different. And so for me, I think it's been actually an interesting experience because it's sort of like when I'm with the Nigerian people, they perceive me as more Zimbabwean. I don't know what that means, but then that's how they perceive me. And then when I'm with Zimbabwean people, it's like, oh my gosh, she's Nigerian. And then there's sort of this special treatment that people give you, which is like, okay, because she's different from us, we need to handle it this way. So this was actually something that happened even when I was little at school, and I did notice those dynamics. I didn't think too much about it because I was a kid, but now looking back, it's like, this is interesting. But also, I think it showed me that I was sort of primed to think more globally because I had to adapt to the way my dad communicates, the way his side of the family communicates, but also engage very differently with my mom's side of the family. So these were things that shaped the way I think and the way I sort of made friends, maintained them, but also my thought processes.
Yeah. So, what did it teach you about yourself and your identity?
I think it taught me that my identity definitely affects how people treat me. That's been the biggest lesson. And I don't know if that's necessarily positive because it's just there were certain stereotypes that were in a sense deprecating, like they put me down and made me feel like, so in Zimbabwe we have this thing where people would watch. African movies, which are like Nigerian movies. And so in a lot of those Nigerian movies, right, there was a lot of witchcraft. So some people, when I tell them I'm Nigerian, would be like, "Oh, so does your family, do these kinds of things?" And that was offensive because it's like, why are you associating me with so much darkness? And so I think the biggest thing has been, okay, the way you are and the way people see you really perceive you really affects how they treat you and the access you have to opportunities.
Yeah. Wow, wow, wow. I feel like I wanted to ask that question and lead with that question in this section because when I found out that you were half Zimbabwean and half Nigerian, I was like, okay, I can only imagine like what you've gone through in relation to that because I understand a little bit of that, not only from my own studies and understanding of Africa, but being of Caribbean descent, sometimes when your parents come from two separate islands, not my parents, I didn't have to deal with that. But when your parents come from two separate islands, it can feel like two separate worlds. And I know how much each culture and each country within Africa has its own set of customs and almost its own cultural pride that I can only imagine how it was for you to navigate both of those worlds. So thank you for shedding light on that.
Yeah. I think something else I want to add is in addition to the whole identity and more, more thought and in terms even career, I think it affected how I think about relationships, not just romantic relationships, but relationships with people and just like relating to people in different environments. So it gave me this skill of adapting my communication style to wherever I'm around, but also really thinking about how my background affects the depth that I can engage with another person as a friend. Even though I can share this with them from a Zimbabwean perspective, there are certain things about being Nigerian that I cannot share with them. So stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's funny because just from my own understanding, a lot of the time when we think about Africa, we think about West Africa first. So I can only imagine like having West African descent, how that might have shown up in Zimbabwe and people thinking, oh, they need to treat you differently because you even talked about the African movies. If you go on Netflix and you type in like African movies, it's a bunch of Nigerian films, it's a bunch of Nollywood. They don't call it Nollywood for no reason. Like it's a bunch of Nollywood films. So that tends to, and I guess I don't know if that affects it as well. The fact that like Nigerian culture is so salient when the world looks at Africa, that might have a lot to do with the fact that the Nigerian side was emphasized, and you might not be able to tell certain sides certain things because of maybe cultural stereotypes on both sides, or even like misunderstandings on both sides.
Yeah. That's correct.
Yeah. So I'm curious about like navigating that like childhood, like what was your education like? So I know you went to boarding school and I think like I'm not sure if the show is called Thicker Than Water on Netflix, but we tend to have dreams about like, African private schools or boarding schools. A lot of us like there's a lot of television around that. So we tend to think that it is, a bed of roses, but I know that there like every educational context that there are challenges. So like what was that experience like? And is boarding school common in your country? Like how did it shape and mold you as a person?
That's another fascinating question because it was definitely an experience. So I'll start with the easier part to answer, which is I would say it's pretty common, especially in terms of high school. People believe that that's where in boarding schools students tend to learn better because you're not having to do with family dynamics. You don't have to come to school to do dishes. So I come from school, then do dishes at home. There's more time to study, is how parents think about it. So I would say that is pretty common and it's standard. So I've noticed when I talk, oh, I went to boarding school for high school, the Americans especially, they look at me weird, like, okay. And they perceive it as if it was a private school. But my school was mission school that was a Catholic school. So the experience is very different from a Zimbabwean public school that's run completely by the government. So at my school, we also had to blend in Catholic beliefs, practices, and they really influenced the way the way we lived at school, the way we also communicated with one another, and this just the general structure of how the school was run. And so I think for the most part it was challenging, definitely challenging. I think it forced me to be resilient, to be honest. I was not willingly choosing to be resilient. I just had to be resilient because it was like a very, very competitive school. And so you really had to work hard, study hard, and even the timetable and the way we went through school from the 6 years I was at that school, you really were primed to just be a hard worker and spend most of your time with your books. And so I think I had to be resilient because I was also navigating some health issues and all that stuff. So it was hard to be someone who is studying hard, but is also having to attend to the fact that I'm sick, and this is making it hard for me to attend to class. So that's why I say I was forced to be resilient. It wasn't like, okay, it wasn't easy. But at the same time, it was fun because so many different personalities. Sometimes you are sleeping in a dormitory with 20 plus people. It's just like navigating the roommate dynamic there is, I don't know how I did it because it's, when I came to the US and I had like two roommates, it was just like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed. But then when I think about, we used to call them like from what we call form 1 to 4, we slept in dormitories where we called them barracks because there were so many of you in there. Um, so it was just really an environment where you're studying, okay, this is this person's level of hygiene, this is how, their study style, what can I learn from them, as well as what do I, not want to be part of my own habits and routine. But for the most part, it was inspiring because they're high achievers, the students are high achievers. And so it's like, I really want to be like her. It was an all girls school, by the way. I really want to be like her, and I want to learn from her. So it taught me how to be collaborative as well, because if I didn't understand a subject, there were many subjects that didn't come naturally to me. I would just go to someone and be like, hey, can you explain this topic? So that was beautiful to have, and to have as a foundation for, what's going to be the rest of my life, like my career, college, all that stuff. So I do think it was a mixed bag, but for me it was also the most challenging, because that's where I started getting into things like mental health, because I was struggling to, yeah.
Yeah, wow, wow. I think like that's a lot of things to happen in boarding school. And I love the fact that you talked about like I feel like the take that you have on the roommate dynamic is probably the most positive that I've ever had. I've ever heard. Usually it's like, okay, well, I didn't want to live with these people.
You had no
They
choice in
destroyed
that
my
dorm.
life
Like you just have
legit.
to work with them.
Yeah. I love how you talked about number one, you were able to learn from other people, like learn from the bad hygiene, the good hygiene, but also learn from like their study skills or study habits. And you talked about the power of getting people in the same space. One of my favorite like theories in psychology is called the mere exposure effect. So it basically says that the more that you're exposed to someone, the more you begin to like them. And I think there's something powerful about living with people or even living in the same space with people. I can think of my college friends that I still have from today. My best friend from college, she lived right next to me in college. So I think like the power of seeing people over and over again, it gives us it creates those ties that bind, and it gives us that sense of community. So you were able to, if you were struggling with something, go to someone and say like, hey, like I'm struggling, like can you help me? And they were actually able to help you. So I love that. And then you talk about resilience, like that must not have been easy to be in that landscape because you're away from your family and then you're also dealing with, like you said, a competitive atmosphere. You're dealing with mental health. You're dealing with a lot of the things that I could think of, in the United States that we deal with at the college level. You're dealing with that at a far younger age. So I want to salute your resilience to dealing with those sort of things at a young age because man, I see like the 18 to 21 year olds, 22, 23-year olds struggling in the US college system. So I could only imagine like how it must have been for you at that age to have to navigate all of those changes.
Yeah, it was fascinating because I was there. Usually, people are there from, not usually, but typically people are there from the age of 13 to 16 because we take O level exams, and then after that, you have to sort of reapply to come back depending on what grades you get. So sometimes some of the people you learned with come back, but other times they end up going to other schools for the last 2 years. So I was there for the time I was 13 to 18, and it kind of like how you mentioned that your best friend lived next to you. It's interesting to me because I was again in a space where these people were coming from very different parts of the country. Like, so it was dealing with people who are from different regions and learning more about their own culture. So it's like, okay, now there's different subcultures. So it was fascinating, like you mentioned. And it's just seeing that also it's okay to struggle because another person is struggling. It's like, okay, you're not alone, even though that's still hard to have to witness.
I want to know about Uche in the classroom because I know it was a competitive school, but you probably still found some things about it that made you that excited you. Because I think high school is that time where like we actually begin to realize, okay, like I'm good at this, I like this, I don't like this. We start to develop these really strong preferences, and those tend to, I guess, lay the foundation for our lives and our careers moving forward. So, tell me about who you were in high school. Like, what were your favorite subjects, and like, what were the career paths that interested you and like caught your eye like during that time?
I don't know about favorite subjects, but I can tell you my favorite subject. By far, it was literature. In literature, because we separated English language from literature. So literature was the books, the analyzing poetry, analyzing, the novels, studying characters, and then English language was, grammar, punctuation, writing skills. And oddly enough, I found literature way easier than English. So I don't know how that happens. But I loved it so much because, yes, it came naturally. But again, I was always interested in getting to know people at a deep level, and studying characters and fleshing them out was just amazing to me. It was when I realized that I love art subject, even though I was more in the business classes, and I loved those classes. But then I think I still enjoyed literature more. So I loved what we called commercy, which is basically a lighter version of accounting. You're studying a lighter version of accounting plus business studies. You're studying how businesses operate. You're studying how, like, you have bookkeeping, but very lightly. And so, because again, that one allowed me to be creative about my responses to certain questions and how maybe things operate in the business world versus accounting, which is very much structured. And there was another part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, there was another part of the question. It was like, what were the career paths that interested you and you would say like caught your eye at the time?
So I think I can give it, like I mentioned, we have form 1 to 4, then form 5 to 6. So there's that gap. So from form 1 to 4, I was focused on, I thought I wanted to be an accountant. And so a lot of my choices for careers, to be honest, have been influenced by what people wanted from me and what they thought, because they thought I have certain strengths, they projected certain careers. So my uncle is an accountant. They were like, "Uche, you're good at accounting, you can be an accountant." And so I was like, no brainer, I want to be an accountant. But when I started struggling with accounts, it's like, I don't want this. But also I didn't know so much. Like I said, I was learning from my classmates. I then had a classmate that she one time in classroom she answered she wants to be an entrepreneur. And so we sat across each other and I asked her, I was like, what is an entrepreneur? Can you, because I like the word. I like words. And then she explained, I was like, okay, this actually sounds way more open than this accounting thing. And so from that time, so it was more like first 2 years, I wanted to be an accountant. Second 2 years, I wanted to be an entrepreneur because someone just said she wants to be an entrepreneur. And then later on, the last two, around the time I started accepting that, you know what, I'm really struggling with these mental health issues, and learning that it's unfortunately common, and it's not just me. I was doing research on what are these symptoms, what does this mean. I was interested in being either a psychiatrist or psychologist. I didn't know the differences at the time. So those were my top three things that I wanted to be. I definitely wanted to be a business person, and at some point a psychologist. Yeah.
Yeah, I think your story highlights a couple of things that tend to go wrong with high school for a lot of us. Like, number one, I think we always feel like, even at that young age, that we have to choose. And your, I guess, like dilemma between like the literature that makes you feel alive and then the business side that is more practical, that's something that a lot of us face. A lot of us had to ask ourselves, like, is the arts for me? Is business for me? And what I would tell people today is what I know about business and entrepreneurship is that you can be an entrepreneur literally through anything, right? And I feel like it's important to take that business thinking and apply it to something you're passionate about. So what I tell people now is you don't have to choose. But for some reason, when we're 16, 17, and the world is on our back and saying you got to fill out these college applications or university applications or take these entrance exams, we feel like how we present ourselves and the types of careers we say we want to do, they say a lot about who we are. And what I always say to people is that they don't say anything about who you are, just what you're interested in. So I think that dilemma really highlights something that a lot of us, including I, went through. But I also love the fact that you talked about people projecting careers onto you.
So many times. Yeah.
That happens far too much. And I feel like, okay, we are just, I feel like we are one big like African family because my Caribbean background as well dealt with that situation, like people projecting careers, making it seem as if, you got to work this career to be somebody, or this is what I think is respectable. And oftentimes it's a doctor, it's a lawyer, it's an accountant, it's someone with a professional title. And it's wonderful that, even though that young lady just said, like, I want to be an entrepreneur, it's wonderful that she was the, like, almost like the vehicle for you to understand there are career paths outside of what is traditional. And one thing I notice about people who are attracted to entrepreneurship, when I talk to them, they usually say that they could have done multiple things. So it's this thing of like entrepreneurship being like a funnel for all of your interests and all of your passions that I think other careers can't give you. So I love that. And then I love how you ended with the psychology part of like you began realizing through your own struggles. One thing I say on this podcast and like this whole season, the listeners are probably going to be like, Saray's a broken record. Yeah, I'm going to be a broken record. I'm gonna be a broken record for my podcast. Absolutely. One thing I say on this podcast a lot is that your area of pain is where your purpose lies. And I also say in a shorthand way, I say your pain is your purpose. And I love the fact that you were able to at that young age realize if I'm suffering from this, other people are suffering from this, and I can be someone who makes a difference. So I love that. I love everything you said, and I relate like 100% to like everything you said.
Yeah, and it's very well said because even in the conversations I've had, it's always been the pain that's like, okay, this is where the transformation is going to come from and has come from. So, yes, I agree.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So you eventually said, right, that you found your calling, right, to become a psychologist or psychiatrist. My question for you is that do you consider that to be your calling? And were there any formative experiences in your youth that made you like lean into this direction?
That question has no answer. Just kidding. Well, not really. I mean, it has an answer to a certain extent. So, at least a solid answer. Sorry. Thinking out loud. I think saying it's my calling is something I want to be like, yes. But I think I also try to deny that it is. That's why I'm finding it hard to answer the question. I think I'm not convinced enough that it's my calling. But I do think intuitively, like at the bottom of my heart, I'm just like, you know what, Uche, like at this point, you need to really take this seriously because your life is has really been painted by this in such a profound way. There's no way that this space is not for you. But then the other part of me is always like, well, you really studied business and you also went to school to study social entrepreneurship and you don't have a psychology degree, so what do you mean? But I do think from an intuition perspective, it really seems like that is the space, even though I am finding it hard to just reconcile because it's a deep space and it's just also a space where you have to be open, at least the part I care about that's not necessarily like deep research. It's very deep empathy, compassion, vulnerability, and also trying to also heal your own wounds. And that's just like it's a lot of work and it's painful. So that's why part of me is just like, well, these are the reasons it's not your calling. But then the part of me that's like, okay, let's really just be blunt. This is where you are supposed to be at some point, yeah. And then there was another part of the question.
Yeah, there's another part of that question. Like, were there any formative experiences in your youth that made you like lean into that direction?
Yes, 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 yes. So, and I would say there still are even now, like in mid 20s. So I think the first time I thought about it was because the level I had gotten to because of depression was just so intense. It was like there has to be a cure to this problem. And what is it? So I would spend with the little internet I had access to, I was learning a lot about what mental health is, what and watching a lot of people tell their stories. And I was just like, I'm not alone in this. This thing is an actual problem, even though people think I'm lacking discipline. Um, and so I think the things I was going through in school and at home were the reason I was just like, I can't live with this all my life. And I don't want my sisters to go through the same thing. There has to be a solution. And so when I found out that it's so, by being, denied access, like at one point, I was getting counseling from a priest, right? When I wasn't, being listened to and given the opportunity to keep meeting him, I was just like, well, this can't keep happening. Someone needs to be available so that people can at least come to them freely. So what does this look like? Oh, there are people called therapists, there are people called psychologists, there are psychiatrists. So that's how I got to that point. It was more not being given that free access to it, and then also being exposed to counselors that were a bit invasive. Yeah, so that was a formative experience that led to it. And then there was another piece.
Yeah, no, that's definitely it. That's it. That's it. That's the
Oh,
question.
really? Oh.
I think, yeah. Woo, that's a lot. Uche, you gave me a lot to take in. I think number one, I have empathy for you in this moment because I know how many of us know that we are called to things, but we don't want to answer to it for various reasons. And you talked about many of the reasons why. Number one, like people, the mental health field is not a field that you can just go into and be like, hey, I want to play counselor one day. You have to do training, you have to study, you need education. There's so many things that you have to do, certification. It really is a process. So the people that go into it kind of have this understanding of like, not only am I called to this, but I'm ready for it. And I began to realize, like in my life, I can feel called to something, but not be ready for it. There are many times in my life where I've been called to things, but I haven't been ready. And I think that might be what you're experiencing right now. You understand, like, there's this deep part of me that wants to take my experience and help people, but I might not be ready for it. And that's totally okay. I can relate to this thing of, I see parallels between you and me. I can relate to this thing of finding fascination in characters, and that soon became a fascination with humans. And I kept on, because I'm spiritual, and I kept on asking God, Lord, am I supposed to be a counselor? I was a peer counselor in college. I, took psychology courses, and I really, really loved it. But I realized that my gift for helping people couldn't be confined to counseling. Like I think, and this is just me like stepping out of the podcast host and just like encouraging you. I realized that my gift for helping people couldn't be confined to counseling. I can go out and help people. And I think that's a huge part of my purpose, but I can help people in different ways. I can podcast, I can motivational speak, I can life coach, I can do much more than just sitting down and counseling. Not to say that counseling isn't a lot, but I had to think and weigh the pros and the cons of that career and realize sitting in a chair and talking to people about their problems every day, I'm gonna become me. Like I'm gonna become me. I'm no longer gonna be love and light and peace and good energy. Like I'm going to become mean. And what I realized is you still can be someone who helps other people. You still can be someone who helps people with their mental health, but there's so many ways to do it. There's research. There's being a social entrepreneur in mental health. There's so many ways outside of traditional therapy and counseling that I think more of us who have that empathy and who also have gone through depression. Like one thing I like to say in this podcast about depression is it's almost like depression is a rebirth. When you come out of it, you're a new person. And I think it changes the way that you see the world. So I encourage you to continue to do that self work, look deep within, and really ask yourself, what do I really want to do? Because helping people with mental health doesn't always have to be psychologist, psychiatrist. It can be there are many different ways you can write on mental health. You can you can create content on it. Now, granted, we need education now. Most of us need education, but we can get certifications, continuing education studies. There's many ways that we can get into the mental health field without having to take it there. So I encourage you to still be true to that while finding, the level of engagement that works for you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate the encouragement because that's definitely, like mentioned, the space I'm currently in. It's like, okay.
Yeah. Cause I think we always think that we have to do things. And I think, maybe this might be your African upbringing. This was my Caribbean upbringing. To do anything, you have to be super educated in it. Like I need you to have all the certifications. I need you to have the doctorate degree. I need you to have, and what I realized is that the Lord had put like something on my heart to do something in mental health as once I'm done with these couple ventures to do something in mental health. And I was just thinking, I was like, God, I'm not qualified to do anything in mental health. But I realized what qualifies me is the willingness. I can partner with people who are researchers, psychologists, neuroscientists. I can build coalitions around things. And I think one thing about being a social entrepreneur that's very unique is that you know how to build. Right. While other people might have domain knowledge, you know how to take their knowledge and bring it into a new format, bring it into an implementation system where their knowledge can be used for good. So I began realizing, okay, my purpose is to help people. Yeah, but there's so many other places outside of counseling that I can do that. And I hope that you get that revelation too, because don't give up on that dream. Don't give up on that dream. I feel like this became a coaching session. Don't give don't give up on that dream.
Yeah.
It might not make sense right now. And like I said, like sometimes we're called to things, but we're not ready for it either. So search your heart and ask yourself if you're ready. Because when you are ready, I think there's this thing like the teacher shows up when the student is ready, right? Like the master, yeah, that's a quote. When you're ready, things show up. Things have a way of kind of showing up when you're ready. So also readiness is
Wow,
cool.
that's
All right.
beautiful.
So we're gonna get into your career, right? And I think like you wear a lot of hats, and that's one thing I love. Like I love that the guests are so multifaceted. Y'all are interesting people. Because when I was in college, I would talk to people about their careers, and they say, "Well, I want to do like finance, or I want to do this one thing." But you all like where I feel like I'm always talking to like. I don't know what they like octopus people. Y'all have like 8 arms and are doing so many different things. And I think that's where, no, that's where life becomes interesting. So I want to know, like, even with an interest in working in the mental health field, you eventually got involved in the entrepreneurship and we could say like social venture development space. Like, why working with entrepreneurs and like, how do you plan to connect the two fields, entrepreneurship and mental health, to like uniquely shape your journey?
So, like, this is so connected to even the first part of the podcast where we talked about me being Nigerian and Zimbabwean. It's as if duality just follows me. It's just like everywhere I go, there's always a sense of, Uche, you have to be somewhere in the middle and take both things and bring them into like one thing. And so I feel like because, and again, if you notice, in high school I was doing business and then I got this interest in psychology. So when I went to college, my thing was okay, social entrepreneurship degree, but it also has a sub focus in mental health. So I was using the tools we were learning in school to form, because of the nature of the program, brainstorm different projects and how there's the business aspect, but also there's the impact, which is okay, the impact focus, which is psychology. So when I graduated, I definitely knew I do not have the certification to be a psychologist, which made sense. And then I also knew, okay, I still have this business education that needs to be fulfilled by experience. And so, by God's grace, I ended up being in a space where it was like, okay, this is how we're going to still allow you to have that opportunity to think in terms of business, but witness how others are using business in creative ways to make impact. And even now, I've also seen fellows who've come to the fellowships do things that are so creative with their business models, but also business models and systems thinking, but also make an impact in mental health without the certification. And it's also been helpful because I know business and entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial thinking, like the front facing side, like fundraising or like getting venture capital, like they're not my strong suit. Okay, I can maintain relationships and I can come up with ideas, but this part of like really being like a more logical entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, is not something I have. So when I got into the space, I was really thinking more in that way, where it's like, okay, this is my not necessarily playground, but this is my time and space to hone in on this aspect. So that by the time I get to the point where I decide, okay, I now have the certification, how am I now making it more accessible? Like we mentioned with the article, it's all about making these resources more accessible to people. And with being a certified psychologist in a hospital or in my own private practice, I don't have as much reach. So I think this is an opportunity to have that solid aspect of, okay, this is how we are building this thing that could grow and spread. And then later on, be thinking in terms of, okay, now let's back it up so I'm more certified and accredited and people can trust me, credibility. That's how I'm thinking
Yeah.
about it. Yeah.
No, I love that. I love that. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. I think like it goes back to what we were talking about like entrepreneurship shaping the way that you see the world, because we can think of like the average person who becomes a psychologist, psychiatrist, or even a counselor, they only think of themselves as like, oh, I'm going to, take on, patients, etc. I'm going to treat people and help people. But oftentimes they lack that systems thinking. Some people do have both, but I think what's unique about your journey, and you're talking about dualities, you're given the ability to develop both, but and also the lived experience. So I could only imagine when your time does come, how powerful you're going to be when the pieces fall because you actually seen, like you said, what it's like to do social entrepreneurship, not just from a creative expression experience where we're coming up with innovative ideas and programs, but also from a funding landscape. Like I'm going in meetings today and I'm telling people like I want to get involved in philanthropy because it's the funding that gives most people the issue. And I've seen that. So when we can take our expertise and like literally social entrepreneurship, you can apply that to any issue area you're passionate about versus that domain experience where which is good. It's good to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but it's great that you're developing a life that will allow you to blend both because that's so powerful. And I often don't see those pieces together.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I like that you mentioned philanthropy because I think in one of the applications I wrote to get into the program that ended up making this miracle happen, the miracle of me coming to the US, um, I mentioned something about being a philanthropist. So I was like, how is Soraya hitting the right place? It's like it's again that mirroring. It's like, wow, definitely parallel to each other.
A lot of us have similar interests and like where we met at the Watson Institute. I can only imagine like funding was a conversation that came up all the time. And I think I always sit around and I collect like amazing people. I always say I'm a collector of amazing people and I always wonder how can I use that, how can I use that for good, how can I use that for good, how can I use the networking power, and like you said, how can you use your ability to connect with people, understand mental health, understand the mental health systems for good. A lot of that is that systems thinking. That's what's lacking. So I love that you talked about it because I know so many talented practitioners and people with great ideas, but it's like, how do I go from 0 to 1? Like that's always said in entrepreneurship. How do I take this? I'm seeing this with my patients, but I want to create this app. I want to create this system. Like, how do I do it? That's where you come in. That's where we're powerful as co-founders or even founders of organizations because we bring that logistical systems thinking, social entrepreneurship mindset. So I love that. I love that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And something you mentioned when you talked about where we met, it reminded me of how, even in the conversations I had separately with individual fellows, it was more so people are you so focused on raising funding and writing grants and making sure they're also doing the on ground work that they're not taking care of themselves. So for me, this is also an opportunity to study how, yes, in college students handle their mental health, but also now, okay, what is the life of an entrepreneur? Why are some of them so burnt out? So that's the other reason that I'm, navigating the space as sneakily as I can, studying people in the background.
That's great. And it shows that you're a studier of people. Like literally, like entrepreneurship is so hard because you're trying to build something and then you're also trying to build your life as well. Like life doesn't stop because we're entrepreneurs. We're fighting life sometimes. Sometimes I'm in the ring and I'm fighting life because it's like I want to do this, but life is saying, hey, no. And there's, timing is so important with entrepreneurship. There's so many uncertain factors that I can see why mental health is an issue for entrepreneurs. And you're really brilliant for touching on that because a lot of people don't talk about that. It's like as an entrepreneur, you're the strong, immovable force. You're not allowed to be vulnerable. You're not allowed to show weakness. And even if you do, investors pull out, things fall apart. So I think it's great. It's great that you also have the experience of working with a target population that really does need a lot of mental health interventions. And when we begin thinking about the intersectionalities of being an entrepreneur of color versus not, or being a woman entrepreneur versus being a man, like there's so many, or being international in the US versus domestic US entrepreneur. There's so many things that like I've spoken to people who have said if their company fails, they're going back to their country. They can't stay here. Like there's so many things and factors. And I love that you're getting exposed to that because that's just going to make you, when you finally do step into like whatever mental health thing you step into, it's just going to make you so much more powerful.
That's so relatable. And I appreciate you mentioning that. Yeah, very good points. Yeah, and so many layers, like you said. Yeah.
So I want to know, like in the mental health field, like there are many ways to contribute effectively from a clinical research or even thought leadership standpoint. Like which domain do you hope to specialize in and why? And if so, is there a particular niche that you see yourself occupying?
Good question. Really taking time to think about this one. I think specialization is the word that I would change there. I think I would say my response is more on because like we mentioned, I'm always like in between. I would say the area I'm I want to have the deepest knowledge in is, I think, clinical. Even though I want to know about the research, I don't think I want to be front field research. So I do want to have deeper knowledge on the clinical side of things, but also know I have enough knowledge to have these conversations, maybe with companies, with parents, and things like that. And then the other side is still knowing enough about business, but honestly, I need a team that has those skills. So in the beginning, yes, I'll try to do things as Uche with maybe some I know, but eventually just be like, okay, let's deepen our knowledge on the clinical side so I can come and, help change and think through strategy with the team, but also still not be so focused on things like fundraising. uh, yeah. And then, because research is it's also, it's more like when I think about getting a PhD or PsyD, it's more like it's just me, and yes, interacting with the populations, but a lot of writing and data collection. And I really, like I mentioned, I really like studying people, but also in an informal context. So so that's why it's hard for me to answer, okay, with certainty, this is the area I want to specialize in. Because I think I'm following curiosity, but also I'm afraid to immediately make the commitment of, okay, because the PhD is a big commitment. Let's do research. But I know, though, that my biggest area of interest at the moment is things like trauma, mood disorders. So psychiatry, uh, and mental illness is more of my focus at the moment. And I think for me, that's the deepest I want to get. It's still enough to have like individual conversations with people as entrepreneurs, maybe offer consulting, services, even if it's voluntary, to just help employers, fellows, and employees just be like, okay, this is how you take care of yourself in general, but then still have enough knowledge to know, okay, now you have to go see a doctor, like for real. Um, so mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and maybe things like relationships between neurology, like neurological disorders, and then psychiatric disorders, stuff like that. Eventually, but commitment, I'm not sure. Like specialization, I don't know. Yeah.
I love this episode because I feel like we're hearing you figure it out in real time. And a lot of no, I just have to keep it real. Like a lot of the guests will come to me, and I'm like, all right, y'all sound a little
Yeah.
that sounds polished, that sounds rehearsed, that's
Yeah.
great. I'm all
I
for the entertainment, but
yeah.
I love how you're like literally just sitting in front of us and you're figuring it out in real time. And I
Yeah.
I think there's something authentic about that, and there's something real about that, like just real.
Thank
Like
you.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're gonna make me tear up because I'm thinking, if people watch this, they're gonna be like, "Well, your thoughts are so scattered." But then I'm just like, "That's the real thing. It's just, well, it's brainstorming time, and it's time to make a decision at some point. Where do I go?" Yeah.
That's the real thing. That's the real thing. And you said that you're kind of like narrowing down clinical, which I think like based on your journey, that makes a lot of sense. Like trying to figure out like, is the helping people the part versus like giving people the knowledge versus like instructing or teaching on mental health. So for you, the direct helping is a huge part of that. Cause like you said, you're an observer of people, but I also agree that it takes time. I mean, all these careers that you listed, super impressive, but they also are high commitment careers. We're talking like studying. If it's psychiatry, it's medical school. There's a lot of things that go into it. So I love the fact that you were just authentic and open because I'm always trying to get, as a podcaster, I'm trying to get the story out of y'all. I'm trying to get the story out of y'all.
You're
But I
doing
think
it. Thank you.
today, you're grounding me and you're making me realize like, okay, yes, there is the story, but the story is still being written.
Mhm.
And I think there's something so wonderful about that because I've come on platforms and I've told people like, hey, I'm figuring it out. And people look at me like I'm funny. But
Yeah.
in reality, we're always figuring it out. So thank you for the honesty and highlighting that. And yes, like clinical or not clinical, psychiatry or psychology, I'm confident that, and get me on record to saying it today, Friday, April 26th, I'm confident that you're going to find your path. It's
Oh,
coming
thank
to you.
you.
And I'm
This
confident
is
that
so
it's coming
special.
soon. That it's coming soon. Yeah, put me on the record that Soraya believed in you.
Yeah. I'm putting it in my journal. And
Yeah,
then I'll
no,
set a
put it in
reminder
your
like,
journal.
five,
Put it
seven
in your
years from
journal.
now.
No, because I definitely believe, and I believe that it's coming for you, and it's gonna happen for you.
Thank
Because I
you.
know, like when I see certain people, I'm like, okay, I know that it's gonna happen for you. Like the way that you work at Watson and the way that you just, the attention to detail, the care, like everything that you put into that. I feel like I need just an episode dedicated to like all the accelerators and incubators that I've been in and like what I've learned from them. But the way that you like care for people, I know it's only a matter of time that what you want is going to happen. So yeah, thank you for you're figuring it out. You're figuring it out, but like it's going to happen soon. And I feel like you're going to get that clarity soon. And hopefully this podcast will be a part of it. Cause I know y'all be listening to this over and over to hear what y'all say. So hopefully, hopefully this
Yeah.
podcast will be a part of this. Okay. So let's get into culture, right? So we talked about you as a person. We talked about your career, how you kind of are navigating that. But one thing we like on this podcast is to talk about the culture. And I always define culture as in who do you want to impact? What cultural impact you want to have? I'm big on legacy. And I know most of the people that I surround myself with are also big on legacy. You know, you all think beyond your time and about what people will say about us when, unfortunately, when we're gone, right? What will people say about us? So, one thing I want to know is when you think about your life and what you hope to achieve, what types of mental health resources, advocacy, or even innovation would you like to contribute to the field?
So I think I'll take it from like, the top level to the tiniest. I do think I want to leave, a good enough mark that art is not necessarily just painting and sketching, but even cooking, that those experiences are so special and that what's happening when we engage with those is soothing and grounding. I think I want people to know and to take advantage of that, but to take advantage of it intentionally. So I do think that maybe through, I don't know if I'll get to a point where I also have like forms of art that I'm, displaying or showing people, but simple things like us sharing the message behind maybe how we felt when we were doing something, why we probably felt that way, and what it means for the specific, mental health experience we're going through, be it burnout, having a bipolar episode, things like that, where it's just art being an opportunity for us to talk through it, not just an opportunity to be like, oh, I expressed it, but taking it a step further to, okay, let's now have a conversation. About it, because oftentimes it's more like, oh, I drew this because, I was inspired, but then there's people not getting to the deeper part of it. So I do think that's the like the big idea, and especially for kids, when I think of culture, I'm really thinking of children, because I do think that they're so wise, but we shut them down and ignore the messages that they're communicating because we think, oh, they're just still growing up. And so I want them to even be the people who are demonstrating this to the adults and teaching the adults this. And then there was another part to the question.
Yeah. What types of mental health resources, advocacy, or even innovation would you like to contribute to the field?
The innovation part, to be honest, I'm still figuring it out and just learning from what's out there. So currently, I don't know. My answer to the overall question is just, it's just a thought, and just like too big picture. I don't have the specific innovation, like the aha, like this is the thing that Uche left. Like I really don't have it yet, but I think that at the simplest level for me, like the tiniest, it's more that I want to leave, knowing that at least one person can pass on that, okay, your life matters enough for this specific, like, knowing that even if it doesn't matter, it comes off as if it doesn't matter to maybe the people who are abusing you and all that stuff. Just knowing that there's a community of people that think you're special and that you should live another day, that for me is enough. If i can if i can tell someone, that someone who's, for example, content warning, was suicidal, and they can hold on to the end of their life knowing that and honing in on that message and passing it on, it's enough for me. It's really enough for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Uche, that is profound. Insert the tears. No, that is just super profound. Like emoji tears are falling from my face. No, like that is very profound. And I think that that's wonderful because I feel like you're exemplifying something that I think about a lot in this podcast. Like sometimes, especially those of us in the social entrepreneurship space, we know all the terminology, the logic models and everything, but not inspiration, but impact is in the one to one. It's in that one person that can say, because of this person, my life is changed. And there was a time in my life where I was like, I'm not successful. And I was down on myself. I was like, oh my God, I'm not successful. We're still pre-launch with the products. Like I was on myself. And then I began to realize I was like, write down every life that you've encountered as an entrepreneur. Write down every intern you've had. Write down every recommendation letter or good word you've put in for someone else. And we realize that impact is in the one to one. It's in the small things. Not to get too spiritual here, but one of my favorite verses in the Bible talks about Jesus leaving the 99 to find the one. And I think about that a lot, that like in life, sometimes we think that the impact is, oh, I'm serving a bunch of people all at the same time. And granted, there's a time for scalability, there's a time for doing all of that. But oftentimes in the early stage of anything, what keeps you going is realizing I'm changing one life. If I can just change one, right? Maybe I can change 100, then maybe 1,000, then maybe 10,000. And I wish we as entrepreneurs had more of that mindset, because I think sometimes scale is such a word that's thrown around that we don't think about the actual impact. We more so think about the numbers, the quantitative impact versus the actual impact, which is it's an emotional thing. Like, how did I make this person feel? How did I change how this person thinks? And that's something that I wish more of us were into, because there's a need for both. But I think what often sustains us at the beginning is realizing, hey, even if I change one life, I'm doing good work.
Yeah, thank you. And you, oh God, why am I about to tear up? This is not the time. Oh, I mean, it's okay to cry.
Yeah.
It's okay to cry. It's just if I choke up, I won't be able to talk. I know myself. So I think, like you mentioned, it's a very emotional thing when you think about, okay, the person you've impacted, like at an individual level. Even when I try to look at like fellows, it's like, oh my gosh, Watson is growing so much. But when I think about an individual fellow, I'm like, I can't believe like because they went through this program, all this stuff is happening, like that one person. Because you start thinking, oh, what's the next thing? Who's the next person in the next group in the program? But also when I think of it, it's again, it's just because it's been passed on to me. People don't even realize how they've saved my life, and it's beyond me. It's like, how do you not remember that moment when you said this thing to me? Because every day I'm about to give up, like each day I'm about to give up, I think about it and I'm like, I can't let this person down because they sacrificed their time just so that I could breathe more. So I don't know. It's just for me, it seems simple, but I don't know. It's a life is so precious. Yeah.
It's those simple acts of kindness. Like I one thing that I do, and I want to share this with the listeners. I do this like positivity jar, and every time someone says something nice to me, I'll put it in. And one thing I realized is I'll put their name down and everything, and people would probably like be like, "Oh, she's so weird," because she remembered I told her that years ago. But I remember years ago, I received such a beautiful compliment that I almost was moved to tears. I received a beautiful compliment on my energy and who I am as a person. And I was like, wow, like I didn't know how people see me this way. And the way that that person opens the door for me to see myself how I didn't see myself, I began receiving so many more of those compliments. And I was like, wow, it only takes that one person to see something in us and to affirm it. And then we go out into the world acting that way. Like, say, for example, like I can tell you, Uche, you're so profound, which you are. But what if you didn't believe that, right? Maybe my compliment opened the door for you to go out into the world and maybe speak up more, be braver, be that profound person in the meetings, add that perspective. And it just shows you that one of my favorite books talks about how ourselves are actually they're shaped by our social interactions. So make sure you have people around you that speak to your highest self, because there are many times in my life where I didn't see myself how others saw me. And those that affirmed me, like you said, in the moments where I felt like I was going to give up, they were the ones that helped me to realize I got to keep going because they see this in me. So I love that. Thank you for that. Thank you for that sentiment. All right. So my last question for you is, today in your current work, how do you stand up for and advocate for mental health in that context? For example, how do you advocate for women on your job or even the international entrepreneurs that you serve and work with?
Mhm. Yeah, good question. And I think it's like with joining over, like it's gonna be almost 2 years in a little bit. I've been in the study phase where it's just like, okay, so if we were to implement something, what would it look like? And so it's been more of a conversation of, okay, how how do we not overwhelm the fellows, but still make space for us to have these conversations. So on the grander side, I don't have like as much exposure, not exposure. I don't have as much of a locked in time to be like, okay, guys, this is how we're going to do it. This is our safe space. We're going to talk about whatever makes you feel comfortable and share resources. But it's been in the individual one on ones I have with fellows where it's just like, okay, they share whatever experience they're going through. It could even be personal, but also challenges they're facing with balancing the program, the different ventures they're running, and it's offering encouragement and tools that they should use or can not should- they can use offline to take care of themselves or even their team sometimes, but also to then my next step is often then pass it forward to the rest of the team and be like, okay, if you could, think about, let's consider their perspective and their feedback on this because this is important for us to modify it because these are like especially the wellness parts are parts we need to when I'm having conversation we need to incorporate more, and it's been done in our because I work across programs in some of the gray block sessions that we have where it's like some guests come in to talk about how people can take care of their teams. And sometimes like program managers lead sessions where they're like, okay, this is what burnout is, this is how you can take care of yourself. And sometimes it's just letting the fellows lead those sessions. So I'm more, when it comes to advocacy, I'm more talking to like my direct manager and being like, okay, in terms of my personal development, these are the ways I'm sort of thinking of how I can be more qualified to have eventually have these sessions with fellows, but also make sure my one-on-ones with them are effective. So far it's really been directly in the one-on-one session check-ins and then just giving the team the feedback I'm receiving and the things I'm sensing from what how fellows are sharing this information to them, so that even as program managers, they can then design and create these spaces where they can actually fellows breathe and catch up with some of the work if they feel overwhelmed. So I'm more focused on sensing, and then when I sense, I then pass it forward to the people who can like actually implement the strategies so fellows have that space. And then in terms of women, it hasn't been anything that's really come up front because our team is predominantly women. It's so many women in our team. Yeah, across the organization. Yeah, we do have men in the team, but it's like mostly women. If you go to our website, you'll see it, and that's a good thing too, because it's just seeing how there's such a it's like for me with the way I extrapolate it is the women are really kind of a foundation of the program, so it's something I'm proud of. And how like we engage with the men is so collaborative, and I absolutely think it's beautiful. It's like a balance, at least in my team, because yeah, that's what I know. After the fellowship, I do have fellows reach out to me, and a lot of the times they need encouragement and just major reminders to take care of themselves because the situations that they're dealing with are very like intense. So that's the other way I do it. Then again, I pass it forward, not explaining sometimes like because there's also confidential aspect, but being like, okay, this is the theme, and I think we need to think about ways we can, have more resources to meet this need. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. And that's one thing I have to say about Watson, and I have to like shout you all out about this. Like the way that you all put the wellness of the fellows first, but not only the wellness, like the welcoming atmosphere. I feel like we left Colorado like kind of like an entrepreneurial family of sorts. Like we check in on each other. There are different things that happen. We have our own group chats and stuff, and we check in on each other and we're transparent with each other. And I think that I've never had that experience ever. And sometimes I was literally leaving Colorado like I'm destined to be an entrepreneur because I'm so blessed to be a part of this community of people that really do care. And I've been to so many other accelerators and incubators, and we didn't have that connection, but we had that connection there, and we really did care for each other. So I love that. All right, Uche, we have gone down all the lanes in this conversation. I want you to leave this conversation knowing that there is support out there for you. Take your pain and make it your purpose. I believe in you. We believe in you. And you will find your way. Listen, I'm finding my way. You will find your way. We will all find our way. Like
Oh,
one
I've
day we
always
will
found
find
it
our way
inspiring.
and we'll listen to this podcast and be like, wow, like where we were at this moment versus where we are now. I know that this podcast is going in like your time capsule as a moment in time. Thank you for sharing your story so vulnerably, so openly. I'm excited to release it. I know it's going to be so powerful. And this is one of those that y'all might need tissues afterwards to listen to. I might have to do a, like a tissue warning at the beginning, like, okay, get your tissues out. But it's one of those things like
This is,
I'm
yeah.
moved by it. This moved me. Thank you. This moved me. And this is what's chicken soup for the soul. I'm fed. Thank you.
I really appreciate your depth and intentionality. It's for me, like I am not ready to cry today. For me, this is such an honor because I I really struggle to share some of the thoughts like on voice, recording and videos, but it's just the like right from the call, the way you reassured me that, it's safe, it's gonna be okay. It's so encouraging. And this feels like a foreshadow of more conversations that are gonna happen. And I can't express my gratitude for that and how it's really going to affect my trajectory moving forward. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All right, y'all. Take care. We'll be back. Wow, everybody. Uche's episode was like a real life coaching session. It was vulnerable and had so many memorable moments. I appreciate Uche's transparency in discussing her own mental health struggles and her childhood and beyond, from her time in boarding school to when she first discovered her interest in entrepreneurship and then mental health. Uche, I want to echo this again. The vulnerability you shared during this episode did not go unnoticed. Wherever you end up as a social entrepreneur, mental health practitioner, or even a mixture of the two, we are here and we are rooting for you. Thank you for reminding us that there is no shame in figuring it all out and that in fact, we are all winging it to a degree. Anyway, this is Soraya and we're out with the podcast for the people, your career, and the culture. I'm out.